The courtroom was silent. The air was thick with tension. Judge Howard sat high on his bench, looking down at the defendant, a small, quiet man in a plain suit. His name was Henry Clark. No one had paid him much attention. In fact, from the moment he walked into the courtroom, people barely noticed him. He had no lawyer. He had barely spoken. The case against him seemed open and shut. Judge Howard smirked. "Do you even understand what's happening here, Mr. Clark?" he asked, shaking his head. "Or do you just enjoy wasting the court's time?" The people in the courtroom chuckled. Even the opposing lawyer, Mr. Wallace, grinned. Henry Clark just stood there, hands in his pockets, his eyes lowered. "You are facing serious charges," Judge Howard continued, leaning forward. "And yet, you have nothing to say for yourself?" Henry finally looked up. There was something strange about the way he did it. Slow, deliberate. His calm blue eyes locked onto Judge Howard's. And then, with the softest voice, he said, "Your Honor, I will present my defense now." And what happened next left the entire courtroom stunned. Henry Clark, the quiet, unnoticed man, began to speak. But it wasn't just any speech. It was a legal argument so sharp, so brilliant, that even the most experienced lawyers in the room were speechless. He quoted obscure laws from memory. He pointed out flaws in the prosecution's case that no one had noticed. He referenced cases from decades ago, making connections that seemed impossible. Every word he spoke turned the case upside down. Judge Howard's smirk faded. His eyes widened. The opposing lawyer, Mr. Wallace, who had been confident just moments ago, suddenly looked nervous. The courtroom, which had been filled with quiet chuckles at Henry's expense, now sat in stunned silence. And then, as Henry delivered his final argument, the judge did something no one expected. He laughed. But this time, it wasn't a laugh of mockery. It was a laugh of pure astonishment. "Mr. Clark," the judge said, shaking his head in disbelief, "who are you?" Before Henry could answer, a loud voice interrupted the silence. A man burst into the courtroom, his face pale. "Your Honor," he shouted, "something terrible has happened." The entire courtroom turned. The tension in the air grew even heavier. Something big was about to happen. The events leading to this moment had started months earlier, long before Henry Clark ever stepped foot in that courtroom. Henry had always been a quiet man. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, worked a simple job at a library, and spent most of his time reading. He never got into trouble. He never raised his voice. But one cold evening, everything changed. Henry had been walking home from work when he saw something strange. A man in a dark suit was speaking harshly to a young woman in an alleyway. She looked terrified. Henry couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Most people would have walked away, but Henry was not most people. He took a step forward. "Excuse me," he said softly. The man in the suit turned. His eyes were cold. "This is none of your business," he growled. Henry didn't flinch. He looked at the woman. "Are you okay?" The woman hesitated. Then, suddenly, she ran. She bolted past Henry, disappearing into the streetlights. The man in the suit glared at Henry. "You just made a big mistake." Henry said nothing. He just watched as the man turned and disappeared into the shadows. At the time, Henry didn't know who that man was. But he was about to find out. The next day, Henry was arrested. The police came to his house early in the morning. They knocked on his door, and when he opened it, they placed him in handcuffs. "You're under arrest," one of the officers said. Henry blinked. "For what?" The officer's expression was unreadable. "You'll find out soon enough." And just like that, Henry was taken away. At the police station, he was informed of the charges against him. Fraud. Embezzlement. A crime Henry knew nothing about. The evidence against him was strong, too strong. It was as if someone had carefully planted every detail to make him look guilty. Henry sat in the interrogation room, staring at the table. He knew what was happening. This was not a mistake. This was revenge. The man in the alleyway had set him up. And now, he had to figure out a way to prove his innocence. The trial moved fast. Too fast. Henry had no money for a lawyer, and the court-appointed attorney barely seemed to care. The prosecutor, Mr. Wallace, was ruthless. He presented the evidence, called witnesses, and painted Henry as a clever criminal who had stolen thousands of dollars. Henry barely spoke. He sat quietly, listening, watching. People in the courtroom whispered about him. He doesn't even defend himself. Maybe he's guilty after all. Even Judge Howard seemed unimpressed. "You're making this easy for me, Mr. Clark," he said one day. If you have nothing to say, then I have no reason to believe you're innocent. Henry just nodded. But inside, he was thinking, watching, waiting, because Henry knew something no one else did. He knew exactly how to turn this case around. And that's why, when the time finally came, when the judge and lawyers and audience all assumed he was a lost cause, Henry stood up. He lifted his head, and he spoke. And in just a few minutes, he turned everything upside down. But before anyone could process what was happening, before Henry could even finish what he started, a voice interrupted. The doors to the courtroom burst open. A man rushed in, his face pale. "Your Honor," he gasped. "Something terrible has happened." Judge Howard's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" The man gulped. His hands were shaking. "It's about the real criminal," he said. And suddenly, the entire courtroom was thrown into chaos. The courtroom erupted into whispers. People turned in their seats, straining to see the man who had just barged in. Judge Howard banged his gavel. "Order in the court," he barked. But the tension was too thick. Even the bailiffs looked uncertain. Henry Clark stood still, watching. He had been moments away from proving his innocence. But now, something unexpected was happening. The man who had interrupted the trial looked terrified. His hands were shaking, and his face was pale as if he had just seen a ghost. Judge Howard narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The man swallowed hard. "My name is David Foster. I work in the district attorney's office. I have new evidence that changes everything." Mr. Wallace, the opposing lawyer, stiffened. "What are you talking about?" David took a deep breath. "We made a mistake," he said. Then his voice dropped. "Henry Clark didn't commit the crime. Someone else did." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Henry remained still. His eyes locked onto David Foster. He had suspected from the start that he was being framed, but now, someone else was saying it out loud. Judge Howard frowned. "And who, exactly, is the real criminal?" David hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned. His eyes landed on someone in the room. Henry followed his gaze. It stopped on Mr. Wallace, the opposing lawyer, the very man trying to send Henry to prison. A deep silence filled the courtroom. Mr. Wallace's face turned stiff, but his hands clenched. "That's absurd," he scoffed. "This is a distraction." "No, it's not," David interrupted. His voice shook. "There's new evidence. A witness has come forward. Documents have been uncovered. The real criminal was using Henry Clark as a scapegoat." Judge Howard leaned forward. His eyes gleamed with suspicion. "Are you saying that Mr. Wallace was involved?" David didn't blink. "Yes." The courtroom exploded into noise. People gasped. Reporters scribbled notes. Even the bailiffs looked stunned. Mr. Wallace's face darkened. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is an obvious stunt. Henry Clark is guilty. The evidence speaks for itself." Judge Howard lifted a hand. The room quieted. He turned back to David. "What exactly do you have?" he asked. "Present your evidence." David hesitated, but then he pulled a thick folder from his briefcase. He walked to the judge's bench, placed the folder down, and opened it. He began flipping through pages, pointing to documents, whispering explanations. Judge Howard's expression changed as he read. At first, he looked confused, then suspicious, then angry, very angry. After several tense minutes, he slammed the folder shut. He turned to Mr. Wallace. "You have some explaining to do," Judge Howard said coldly. Mr. Wallace stiffened. He opened his mouth, but then, a loud bang echoed through the courtroom. Everyone froze. The door to the courtroom had just burst open. Again, a group of officers rushed in, their faces grim. One of them spoke in a firm voice. "Mr. Wallace, you are under arrest." The courtroom gasped again. The air was electric. Mr. Wallace turned pale. "This is insane," he spat. "I am a respected lawyer." "You are also a criminal," the officer cut him off. "We have the evidence to prove it." Two officers moved forward, grabbing Mr. Wallace's arms. He struggled for a moment, then stopped. His jaw tightened. His eyes darkened with hatred. As they locked the cuffs around his wrists, he turned his head slowly toward Henry Clark. "This isn't over," he whispered. Henry didn't respond. He simply watched as the man who had tried to destroy him was led away in handcuffs. The courtroom was still buzzing with shock, but Judge Howard wasn't finished. He turned to Henry. "Mr. Clark," he said, his voice steady, "I believe we owe you an apology." Henry blinked. Judge Howard sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You were innocent from the start, and yet, you were treated like a criminal." That should have never happened. Henry said nothing. He just gave a small nod. Judge Howard looked around the courtroom. This case is dismissed, he announced. Henry Clark is free to go. A loud cheer erupted from the crowd, but Henry barely heard it. He simply turned, walking toward the exit, his hands in his pockets. He had won. He had proven his innocence. And yet, something didn't feel right. Something about the way Mr. Wallace had whispered, "This isn't over." As Henry stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, he had the strangest feeling. This was far from over. And he was right, because waiting for him outside the courthouse was the man from the alleyway, the one who had started it all. And he was smiling. Henry Clark stepped outside the courthouse and froze. The man from the alleyway stood across the street, leaning against a sleek black car. He wore the same dark suit, the same smug expression. His eyes gleamed with amusement, as if this had all been a game to him. Henry's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. Then, the man pushed off the car and strolled toward him, hands in his pockets. The crowd outside the courthouse was too busy celebrating Henry's victory to notice the approaching danger. When he was close enough, the man smirked. Well, he said smoothly. That was quite the performance in there. You had everyone fooled." Henry didn't respond. The man chuckled. "You think you've won, don't you?" He shook his head. "You think you're free?" Henry remained silent, his body tense. The man leaned in slightly. "Let me tell you something, Henry," he said in a low voice. "You may have dodged a bullet today, but you're still in the middle of a war." Henry's jaw tightened. The man straightened up, adjusting his tie. "I'll be seeing you soon." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the busy street. Henry exhaled slowly. His gut told him one thing: this wasn't over. Far from it. That night, Henry returned to his small house, but he couldn't shake the unease in his chest. He sat at his kitchen table, a single lamp casting a dim glow. His case had been dismissed. He was a free man, but something was wrong. Who was that man? Why had he framed Henry in the first place? And what did he mean by, "You're still in the middle of a war"? Henry tapped his fingers against the wooden table, thinking. He had never been the type to pick fights. He lived quietly, worked at the library, and kept to himself. But now, he was caught in something far bigger than he understood. There was only one way to get answers. He needed to go back to the beginning. The alleyway. The woman. The confrontation that had started it all. Henry grabbed his coat. It was time to find the truth. The alley was empty when Henry arrived. It was just as dark and narrow as he remembered, the streetlights flickering weakly above. The smell of damp concrete filled the air. Henry stepped inside, his shoes crunching against loose gravel. His eyes scanned the walls, looking for anything that might explain what had happened that night. And then he saw it. A small, crumpled piece of paper wedged between two bricks. He pulled it out carefully. The ink was smudged, but he could still make out the words. "Help me." His grip on the paper tightened. The woman. She had left this behind. She had been in trouble, and Henry had walked right into something dangerous. His mind raced. He had to find her. She was the only person who could tell him what was really going on. But before he could turn, something cold pressed against the back of his head. A gun. "Don't move," a voice growled. Henry froze. His breath caught in his throat. The man from the alley. He had been waiting for him. Henry Clark stood still, his breath slow and steady. The cold metal of the gun pressed against the back of his skull. The alley was silent except for the distant hum of the city. "Turn around," the voice ordered. Henry did as he was told, moving carefully. When he faced the man, he saw the same cruel smirk, the same calculating eyes. The man held the gun with a steady hand, but there was no fear in his expression. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" the man said, shaking his head. "You won your little trial. You should have gone home, played it safe. But now," his smirk widened. "Now you've made it personal." Henry's voice was calm. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head, amused. "Names aren't important." He chuckled. "But since you're so curious, you can call me Dawson." Henry memorized the name. He knew it wasn't real, but it was something. Dawson flicked his eyes toward the crumpled piece of paper in Henry's hand. "I see you found her little message." His smirk faded. "That's a shame." Henry didn't respond. He didn't need to. Dawson let out a slow breath, then pressed the gun harder against Henry's forehead. "Here's how this works. You're going to forget about this. You're going to go back to your quiet little life, and you're never Going to look for that girl. Henry met his gaze. And if I don't? Dawson grinned. Then I make sure you disappear for good. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Henry's mind raced. He needed to get out of this alive. Think. Think fast. His eyes darted past Dawson, toward the entrance of the alley. A few people walked by on the main street, but they weren't paying attention. If he made a move, he had one shot. Then, without warning, Henry moved. With lightning speed, he grabbed Dawson's wrist and twisted it hard. The gun fired, a deafening bang, but the bullet missed, slamming into the brick wall behind them. Henry didn't stop. He slammed his elbow into Dawson's chest, knocking him back. The gun clattered to the ground. Dawson cursed and lunged for it, but Henry was faster. He kicked the weapon away, sending it skidding across the pavement. For the first time, Dawson's smug expression cracked. His eyes burned with fury. You really don't know when to quit, he spat. Henry didn't answer. He took a step back, preparing for the next move. But before he could react, Dawson pulled something from his pocket. A switchblade. The blade gleamed under the dim alley lights. Henry's pulse quickened. Dawson smirked. Let's see how smart you are without a courtroom to protect you. Then he charged. Henry barely dodged. The knife sliced through the air, missing his ribs by inches. Dawson swung again, this time aiming for Henry's throat. Henry ducked at the last second, then grabbed Dawson's wrist, twisting it violently. The knife fell to the ground with a clink. Dawson snarled and threw a punch. It connected with Henry's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Henry tasted blood. Dawson rushed forward, but Henry saw his opening. With one swift motion, Henry pivoted and slammed his fist into Dawson's gut. Dawson gasped, doubling over. Henry didn't hesitate. He grabbed Dawson's collar and shoved him hard against the brick wall. Dawson coughed, his cocky expression finally gone. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Henry leaned in close and whispered, I don't quit. Dawson let out a weak chuckle, despite the pain. You really are a problem. Henry tightened his grip. Where is she? Dawson smirked again. You think I'll just tell you? Henry narrowed his eyes. No, but I think you're scared. Dawson's jaw twitched. Henry saw it, the slightest flicker of fear. He was onto something. But before he could push further, the sound of sirens filled the air. Both men turned toward the entrance of the alley. Police. Dawson let out a quiet laugh. Looks like we're out of time. Henry snapped his attention back to him. But Dawson moved fast. With one final burst of energy, he slammed his knee into Henry's stomach. Henry stumbled back, coughing. By the time he regained his balance, Dawson was gone. The alley was empty. Henry looked around, his mind racing. He had been so close. Then, the flashing red and blue lights filled the alley, and an officer shouted, Freeze! Hands where we can see them. Henry slowly raised his hands. He had escaped Dawson. But now, he had another problem. Henry Clark stood still, hands raised as the flashing red and blue lights painted the alley in pulses of color. Two police officers stepped forward, guns drawn, their faces hard with suspicion. Step away from the wall, one of them barked. Henry took a slow step forward, breathing evenly. He knew how this looked. He was alone in a dark alley, blood on his lip, a discarded knife and gun nearby. But there was no time for explanations. Officer, he said calmly, this isn't what it looks like. The second officer scoffed. That's what they all say. Before Henry could argue, one of them grabbed his arm and shoved him roughly against the alley wall. He felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists. You're under arrest, the officer said. Henry clenched his jaw. He needed to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help him now. One of the officers grabbed the switchblade and examined it. Well, he muttered. Looks like we got ourselves another criminal. Henry exhaled sharply. That's not my knife. The officer let out a low chuckle. Yeah? Then whose is it? Henry hesitated. He could say Dawson, but without proof, it wouldn't mean anything. And Dawson was long gone. The first officer radioed in. We have a suspect in custody. Possible weapons charge. Henry's stomach tightened. This was bad. He had barely walked free from one false accusation, and now he was tangled in another. But then, a voice called from the street. Wait. Henry turned his head. A woman ran toward them, her coat flapping as she hurried across the pavement. The officers turned to stop her, but she pushed forward. Let him go, she shouted. Henry's heart skipped. It was her, the woman from the alley. The woman Dawson had been threatening. The one who had left the desperate message. Help me. She reached them, out of breath. Her dark brown eyes darted between Henry and the police. "You have the wrong guy," she said firmly. "He's trying to help me." The officers exchanged a glance. The second officer folded his arms. "And who are you?" The woman hesitated. Then she straightened her shoulders. "My name is Emily Carter," she said. Henry memorized it instantly. Emily turned to Henry, her expression full of guilt. "I should have come forward sooner," she whispered. The first officer narrowed his eyes. "And how exactly is he helping you?" Emily swallowed. He saved me." One officer scoffed. "Saved you? From what?" Emily hesitated. Her hands clenched into fists. Then, in a quiet but steady voice, she said, "From them." Silence fell over the alley. Henry watched the officers' expressions shift. They weren't convinced, yet. Emily took a deep breath. "There's a man," she said. "His name is Dawson. He works for powerful people. Dangerous people. He threatened me. And when Henry stepped in to help, they framed him for a crime he didn't commit." The officers remained still. They exchanged another glance, as if silently debating whether to believe her. Then, the second officer spoke. "Start from the beginning." An hour later, Henry and Emily sat inside a police station. The officers had finally uncuffed him, but he could tell they were still skeptical. Emily sat across from him, rubbing her hands together. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Henry leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Emily let out a shaky breath. "Dawson isn't just some thug," she said. "He works for someone, a man named Victor Langley." Henry frowned. "Who's that?" Emily bit her lip. "You wouldn't know his name. But he owns half the city. Real estate, businesses, the police, the courts." She swallowed. "And he runs things from the shadows." Henry's mind raced. Victor Langley. The name meant nothing to him, but the way Emily said it made his skin crawl. Emily continued. "I used to work for him. I was just a secretary at first, but over time, I started seeing things. Illegal transactions, bribes, people disappearing." Her hands trembled. "I wanted to leave. I tried to leave. But once you know too much, they don't let you go." Henry's stomach tightened. Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "They killed my friend, Henry." Her eyes shone with tears. She tried to expose them. "And now, they're coming for me." Henry exhaled. He had stepped into something far bigger than he realized. He was no longer fighting just to clear his name. He was up against powerful men who played by their own rules. Henry sat back. "Why frame me?" Emily bit her lip. "They wanted a distraction. A scapegoat." She looked at him, guilt flashing across her face. They needed someone harmless. Someone who wouldn't fight back. Henry gave a small, bitter smile. "They picked the wrong guy." Emily let out a weak chuckle. "Yeah, they did." Then, suddenly, boom. The windows of the police station shook as a deafening explosion rattled the building. Henry and Emily ducked instinctively. Officers shouted. Alarms blared. Henry turned toward the window, and his blood ran cold. Across the street, a car was engulfed in flames. Someone had just sent a message. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Flames roared outside the police station, painting the night sky in shades of orange and red. The heat from the explosion could be felt even from inside. Officers scrambled, radios buzzing with frantic voices. Henry Clark stood frozen, staring at the burning car. It wasn't just any car. It was one of the police cruisers. A message. A warning. And the worst part? Whoever did this knew exactly where Henry and Emily were. Emily let out a sharp breath beside him. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "They found me," she whispered. Henry clenched his fists. No, this wasn't just about Emily anymore. It wasn't just about him. This was a war, and it had just begun. The station went into lockdown within minutes. Officers rushed to secure the building, reinforcing exits and pulling out weapons. Henry and Emily were moved to a back room, a small office with no windows, just a flickering desk lamp and a few chairs. Two officers stood guard outside the door. Emily sat down, her body tense. "They won't stop," she murmured. "Victor Langley has too much power. If he wants someone gone, they disappear." Henry sat across from her, thinking. "Then we don't disappear," he said. Emily gave a weak, bitter laugh. "Easier said than done." Henry leaned forward. "You know more than anyone else. You've seen their crimes firsthand. If we can get proof, real proof, we can take them down." Emily's eyes darted to the door. "You don't get it, Henry. The law can't touch Langley. He owns the law. Asterisk, asterisk." Henry's jaw tightened. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a hero. But he knew one thing. Every empire had a weak spot. He just had to find it. Emily hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. There's a ledger, she whispered. A book. Langley keeps it hidden. Every deal, every bribe, every crime. It's all in there. Henry's pulse quickened. Where is it? Emily swallowed. I don't know, but I know someone who might. Henry waited. Emily lowered her voice. His name is Ethan Graves. He used to be Langley's right-hand man, but they had a falling out. Now he's hiding. Henry's mind raced. A man on the inside. This could be their chance. Where do we find him? Emily hesitated, then whispered, a bar. Downtown. The Black Raven. Henry nodded. Then we go there. Emily frowned. We're locked in a police station, remember? Henry looked at the door. The officers were still standing guard. They couldn't stay here. Langley's men were coming. Henry exhaled. Then we find a way out. The station was still on high alert, officers pacing back and forth. Smoke from the explosion lingered in the air. Henry knew they didn't have much time. He turned to Emily. Follow my lead. Then, he stepped into the hallway. The two officers immediately blocked his path. Where do you think you're going? One of them asked. Henry kept his face calm. We need to leave. The officer let out a dry laugh. Nice try. Henry sighed. Look, you and I both know that car bomb wasn't random. The people who did this, they're coming. And when they do, they won't care if you have badges. The officers exchanged an uneasy glance. Henry pressed forward. You can either let us walk out of here, or you can deal with what's coming. The officers hesitated. Then, one of them spoke. There's a back exit. Henry didn't question it. He grabbed Emily's hand, and they ran. The alley behind the police station was dark and empty. No sirens. No flashing lights. For a brief moment, everything was quiet. Emily caught her breath. Where now? Henry didn't hesitate. The Black Raven. They had one shot, and time was running out. The night air was thick with tension as Henry and Emily moved through the city streets, their footsteps quick but careful. The Black Raven was at least 15 blocks away, nestled in a rough part of downtown. They couldn't take a cab, not when Langley's men were likely watching every exit from the police station. They had to move fast. Henry kept glancing over his shoulder. Someone was watching. He could feel it. Emily hugged her coat tightly around herself. Are you sure about this? Henry nodded. Ethan Graves is our only lead. If he knows where Langley's ledger is, we have a chance to stop this. Emily swallowed hard, but said nothing. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. Then, the sound of a car engine revving. Henry's pulse spiked. A black SUV turned onto the street behind them, its headlights cutting through the dark. It was moving slow. Hunting slow. Emily saw it too. Henry, run. They took off. The SUV's tires screeched as it sped up, the roar of the engine filling the street. Henry and Emily darted into a side alley, their feet pounding against the pavement. A gunshot rang out. The bullet hit a metal dumpster just inches from Henry's head. Emily screamed. They didn't stop. Henry grabbed her wrist, pulling her into a side street. Faster. Another shot. Sparks flew as a bullet ricocheted off a fire escape. The SUV swerved into the alley, its tires skidding on the wet concrete. The doors swung open. Two men in dark suits jumped out, guns drawn. Henry didn't hesitate. He shoved Emily through a chain-link fence. Go. She squeezed through the gap, stumbling onto the other side. Henry turned to follow. Too late. A hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him back. A fist crashed into his stomach. Henry doubled over, gasping. The second man grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. You really don't know when to quit, one of them growled. Henry gritted his teeth. Yeah, he gasped. It's a bad habit. The first man pulled a gun from his jacket. Langley wants you alive. But he didn't say in what condition. Henry's heart pounded. He needed to act, now? The second man tightened his grip. Henry shifted his weight. Then, in one fluid motion, he slammed his heel into the man's shin and threw his head back, cracking it into the guy's nose. The man yelped, staggering backward. The second man aimed his gun. Henry knocked it away. The gun skidded across the pavement. Emily rushed back. Henry. Henry turned. Just as the first man swung a crowbar at his head, Henry barely dodged. The metal whistled past his ear. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted, hard. The crowbar clattered to the ground. The second man lunged, a knife flashing in his hand. Henry caught his arm mid-swing and slammed him into the alley wall. The man crumpled to the ground. Henry turned to the last attacker. The man hesitated, then bolted. Henry let him run. He turned to Emily. She was staring at him, wide-eyed. She swallowed. Are you always this terrifying? Henry wiped the sweat from his brow. Only on bad days. Then, sirens. Flashing lights appeared at the end of the alley. Police cars skidded to a stop. Henry's chest tightened. More trouble. The Black Raven was a dive bar. The kind of place where nobody asked questions and everyone had secrets. Henry and Emily slipped inside, unnoticed. The place smelled like cheap whiskey and cigarette smoke. A jazz song played softly from an old jukebox. Henry scanned the room. Then he saw him. A man sitting alone in the back. Ethan Graves. His hair was streaked with gray, his face weathered. He was nursing a glass of whiskey, his eyes tired. Henry and Emily walked over. Ethan didn't look up. Whatever you want, I don't have it. Henry pulled out a chair and sat down. We're not here to cause trouble. Ethan let out a dry laugh. Then you're in the wrong place. Henry leaned in. It's about Langley. Ethan finally looked up. His eyes were sharp. Say that name a little louder, why don't you? Emily sat down beside Henry. We know about the ledger. Ethan's expression darkened. Henry pressed on. You used to be his right-hand man. If anyone knows where it is, it's you. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temple. You have no idea what you're asking. Emily swallowed. I know what Langley does to people who cross him. Ethan's hand tightened around his glass. Yeah, he muttered. You and me both. Henry met his gaze. Help us. For a long moment, Ethan didn't say anything. Then, he leaned forward. I can get you to the ledger. Henry's pulse quickened. But, Ethan added, if we do this, there's no turning back. Henry already knew that. He nodded. Ethan finished his whiskey, then stood up. Let's go steal from the devil. The night air was thick with tension as Henry, Emily, and Ethan Graves stepped out of the Black Raven. The streets were quiet, but Henry's instincts screamed that they were being watched. Ethan led them down a side alley, moving fast but careful. Langley doesn't keep the ledger in his office. That'd be too obvious, he muttered. He's paranoid. He stashes it somewhere off the books. Henry kept his voice low. Where? Ethan glanced at him. A private vault. Downtown. Hidden under one of his clubs. Emily frowned. A club? Ethan smirked grimly. The Venetian Room. Henry had heard of it. A high-end, invitation-only club where the city's elite gathered. The kind of place dripping in corruption. Ethan continued. Langley built a panic vault under the club. Fireproof. Bulletproof. If anything goes wrong, he can lock himself in there with all his secrets. He glanced at Emily. And that's where he keeps the ledger. Emily exhaled. So, we break into one of the most secure places in the city? Ethan shrugged. Basically. Henry's mind worked fast. How do we get in? Ethan smirked. Funny you ask. Because that's the hard part. They gathered in a small apartment Ethan used as a safe house. Maps, documents, and blueprints were scattered across a table. Ethan tapped a photo of the Venetian Room. This place is locked up tight, he explained. Armed guards. Security cameras. And the vault? Biometric access only. Emily folded her arms. Meaning? Ethan looked at Henry. Meaning the only way to open it is with Langley's handprint. Silence filled the room. Henry exhaled slowly. That complicates things. Ethan leaned back. I see two options. One, we kidnap Langley and make him open it. Emily gave him a deadpan look. That sounds insane. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, it is. That's why we go with option 2. He pointed to a different map. Tomorrow night, Langley is hosting a private party at the Venetian Room. High rollers. Politicians. People who think they own the world. Henry followed the plan. We infiltrate the party. Ethan nodded. Get inside, get close to Langley, and lift his handprint. A glass, a doorknob, doesn't matter. Once we have it, we use a 3D print to fool the scanner. Emily raised an eyebrow. And then we just stroll into the vault. Ethan smirked. That's the easy part. Henry didn't like the way he said easy. The next evening, the Venetian Room was alive with wealth and power. Expensive suits, glistening jewelry, laughter that reeked of arrogance. Henry and Emily arrived dressed to blend in, him in a sharp black suit, her in a sleek red dress. Ethan had set them up with forged invitations, slipping them past security. As they walked in, Henry scanned the room. Chandeliers dripped with gold. A jazz band played soft music in the corner. Then he saw him. Victor Langley. The man was everything Henry expected. Tall, lean, and dangerously composed. He wore a deep blue suit, his silver hair slicked back. Power radiated off him. And standing just behind him, Dawson, the man who had tried to kill Henry. Henry kept his expression neutral, but his pulse quickened. Dawson was watching the room carefully, looking for threats, looking for Henry. Emily whispered, "He's here." Henry nodded. "Stick to the plan." They moved carefully, blending in with the crowd. The goal was simple: get close to Langley, grab a fingerprint sample, and get out. Ethan had slipped in through a side entrance, running interference with security. Emily grabbed a glass of champagne from a waiter's tray. "I'll get him to touch something." Henry hesitated. "Be careful." Emily winked. "Aren't I always?" She turned and walked straight toward Victor Langley. Henry held his breath. Emily reached him with effortless grace, pretending to stumble. "Oh, I'm so sorry." Langley barely blinked. His reflexes were fast. He reached out, grabbing her arm to steady her. Henry's eyes flickered to her bracelet. It was a special piece Ethan had given her. Tiny glass fibers on the surface. When Langley's fingers touched it, the print was copied. Emily smiled apologetically. "Clumsy me." Langley gave her a polite, empty smile. "It happens." She excused herself, gliding back toward Henry. He exhaled. "You got it." She lifted her wrist slightly. "He practically handed it to me." Henry almost smiled. Then, Dawson's eyes locked onto them. Henry froze. For a moment, the entire room felt like it had gone silent. Dawson's gaze narrowed. He recognized Henry. Henry grabbed Emily's hand. "Time to go." They turned toward the exit. Too late. Dawson pulled something from his jacket and spoke into it. "Found him." Henry's stomach dropped. Langley's guards moved. They weren't getting out without a fight. The air inside the Venetian room shifted. It was subtle. Too subtle for the oblivious guests sipping champagne and laughing about stock portfolios. But Henry felt it. The guards moved with purpose. Dawson had spoken just seconds ago, but already 3 men in suits were making their way through the crowd. Their steps were calm, measured. No need to rush. No need to make a scene. Henry knew that kind of confidence. These weren't hired muscle. These were killers, and they were coming for him. Emily's grip tightened around his hand. "Henry, I see them," he murmured. She stole a glance over her shoulder. "How do we get out?" Henry scanned the room. Their original exit, the grand doors leading back to the lobby, was already covered. A 4th guard stood near them, pretending to be a guest, but Henry wasn't fooled. "Side exit," he whispered. Emily nodded. They moved casually, weaving through the crowd. If they ran now, it was over. They had to blend in, make it seem like they were just another rich couple enjoying the party. Ethan's voice crackled through Henry's earpiece. "You're in trouble, aren't you?" Henry kept his expression neutral. "What gave it away?" "Oh, I don't know." The armed men closing in. Emily took a glass of wine from a passing waiter, pretending to sip. "We have Langley's print. We just need to get out." Ethan's tone sharpened. "Security's already tightening. You have about 30 seconds before they fully lock this place down." Henry turned slightly. One of the guards was almost on them. They needed a distraction. Fast. Then, the fire alarm blared. Guests gasped. Confused murmurs spread through the room. Ethan chuckled in Henry's earpiece. "You're welcome." Henry wasted no time. "Move." They ran. The Venetian room's back hallway was quieter, but no less dangerous. The red glow of emergency lights flickered against the polished floors. Henry and Emily sprinted, heels clicking against marble. A door burst open ahead. 2 guards stepped out, guns drawn. Henry grabbed Emily and dived sideways. Bang! A bullet shattered a glass display behind them. Guests screamed in the main room. Emily yelped, barely catching herself. "This is not how I planned my night." Henry ignored her, pulling her behind a pillar. The guards advanced, eyes scanning the hall. "Come out," one of them called. "Make it easy." Henry's mind raced. Then he saw it. A waiter's tray had been knocked over in the chaos. On it, several bottles of aged whiskey. An idea sparked. He grabbed a bottle and glanced at Emily. "Cover your eyes." "What?" Crash. Henry smashed the bottle against the hallway light above them. Sparks flew. Glass rained down. The hallway plunged into darkness. The guards cursed. Henry moved. Fast. One of the men raised his gun. Henry grabbed his wrist and twisted. A shot fired. Wild, missing. Emily ducked. Henry didn't stop. He elbowed the guard in the ribs and slammed his head against the wall. The man crumpled. The second guard turned. Emily kicked him hard in the knee. He stumbled, just enough for Henry to land a clean punch. The man went down. Silence. Emily breathed hard. Did we just win? Henry listened. No more footsteps. For now. They ran. The Venetian room had an underground loading dock for VIPs who didn't want to be seen. That's where Ethan was waiting. Henry and Emily burst through the back doors. Ethan stood next to a black sedan, grinning. Took you long enough. Henry climbed into the passenger seat. Drive. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. The tires screeched as they peeled out of the underground lot. Through the rearview mirror, Henry saw Dawson step outside. Their eyes locked. Dawson's face was unreadable. Then he smiled. Henry's stomach twisted. Dawson never looked worried. He looked amused. Henry turned to Ethan. They let us go. Ethan frowned. What? Henry clenched his jaw. Dawson could have stopped them, but he didn't. Which meant they were walking into a trap. The black sedan sped through the city, headlights slicing through the dark streets. Inside, the tension was thick. Henry sat in the passenger seat, jaw clenched, his mind racing. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, his other gripping a small pistol. Emily sat in the back, her breath unsteady, still processing everything that had just happened. They had done it. They had Langley's handprint. But Dawson had let them go, which meant this wasn't over. Emily finally broke the silence. Where are we going? Ethan didn't take his eyes off the road. A place I know. We need to get the print processed fast. We might have one shot at this. Henry exhaled. And what happens when Langley realizes we're breaking into his vault? Ethan smirked. Oh, he already knows. Emily tensed. So we're walking into a trap? Ethan shrugged. Depends on how fast we move. Henry's fists tightened. We need to be faster. 15 minutes later, Ethan pulled into a rundown auto shop on the outskirts of the city. It looked abandoned, faded signs, shattered windows, weeds growing through cracked pavement. But the moment Ethan honked twice, the garage door rattled open. A short, stocky man with oil-stained hands stepped out, scowling. What the hell do you want at this hour? Ethan smirked. Good to see you too, Ray. Ray sighed, wiping his hands on a rag. This better be important. Ethan tossed him a small drive. We need a 3D printed replica of a handprint. Fast. Ray muttered something under his breath, then waved them inside. The garage was cluttered, half-disassembled cars, workbenches covered in tools, and in the corner, a high-tech workstation with multiple 3D printers. Henry raised an eyebrow. Ray caught his look. What? You think I just fix cars? He plopped into a chair and plugged in Ethan's drive. All right, let's see what we got. The screen flickered. Langley's handprint appeared. Emily watched nervously as Ray worked, tweaking the file. How long will this take? Ray cracked his knuckles. If you stop talking? 15 minutes. Ethan checked his gun. That's about 14 minutes longer than I'd like. Henry stayed quiet. He was watching the street. Something felt wrong. Too quiet. He glanced at Emily. She felt it too. He could see it in her tense shoulders. Then, the lights flickered. A bad sign. Ray cursed. That's weird. Henry stepped toward the door, pressing his back against the cold metal. He listened. Footsteps. Outside. More than one. Henry turned sharply. We need to go? Now. Ray scoffed. Relax, man. This place is secure. Bang. The front window exploded. Glass rained down as a bullet whizzed past Henry's head. Emily screamed. Ray dived under the table. Ethan was already moving. He grabbed a shotgun from under a workbench and fired. Boom. The blast tore through the door, making whoever was outside scatter. Henry grabbed Emily's wrist. We're exposed here. Ray scrambled out from under the table. Are you insane? Who the hell is shooting at us? Ethan gritted his teeth. Bad people. Henry ducked as more gunfire tore through the garage. Sparks flew. Emily pulled Ray up. Can we still get the print? Ray's face was pale, but he nodded quickly. It's almost done. 30 seconds. Henry peeked through the shattered window. Black SUVs lined the street. Dawson's men. He turned to Ethan. We're outnumbered. Ethan pumped the shotgun. I like those odds. Henry yanked a wrench off the workbench. We need to move fast. Then the garage doors exploded inward. A wave of armed men rushed in. The fight had begun. The first guy aimed at Henry. Henry threw the wrench. It slammed into the man's hand, knocking his gun away. Henry lunged, landing a solid punch to the jaw. The guy went down. Emily grabbed a crowbar and swung at another attacker. It cracked against his ribs. He grunted, stumbling backward. Ethan fired the shotgun again. Another man dropped. Ray grabbed the finished 3D print from the machine. "I got it," he yelled. Henry grabbed it, stuffed it into his jacket, and turned. "We need to get to the car." Ethan fired one last shot before grabbing Emily's hand. They ran. More gunfire erupted behind them. Henry smashed through the garage's side door, bursting into the alley. The black sedan was parked there, engine running. Ethan jumped into the driver's seat. "Move." Henry threw Emily into the back seat and dove in after her. Tires screeched. The sedan peeled out, bullets ricocheting off the pavement behind them. Henry looked back. Dawson stood in the wreckage of the garage, watching them escape, still smiling, like he knew something they didn't. They drove in silence for several minutes. Finally, Emily spoke. "We have the print." Henry nodded. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Then we finish this." Henry exhaled. "Where's the vault?" Ethan smirked. "Right under Langley's nose." Henry's pulse quickened. This was it. The final heist. If they pulled this off, Langley's entire empire would crumble. But if they failed, they wouldn't get a second chance. The car sped through the empty streets, the city lights casting long shadows. Inside the sedan, Henry, Emily, and Ethan sat in tense silence. They had Langley's handprint. They had a plan. And now, they had to break into one of the most secure vaults in the city. Henry turned to Ethan. "Tell me everything." Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel. "Langley's vault is under the Venetian room. Private access. No visible entrance. No security cameras." Emily frowned. "If there's no entrance, how do we get in?" Ethan smirked. "Oh, there's an entrance. It's just not meant for people like us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small keycard. Henry's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get that?" Ethan shrugged. "Let's just say an old friend owed me a favor." Emily leaned forward. "So we swipe the card and walk right in?" Ethan laughed. "I wish. No, the card gets us into the staff-only elevator. The vault is hidden below that. That's where the real fun starts." Henry exhaled. "What kind of security are we looking at?" Ethan's grin faded. "Motion sensors, pressure plates, armed guards, and the vault itself? Biometric scanner and a 10-digit rotating code." Emily groaned. "Perfect. Just perfect." Henry stayed focused. "The handprint gets us past the scanner. What about the code?" Ethan hesitated. "That, we have to figure out on the spot." Emily's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Ethan shrugged. "You think Langley writes his passcode on a sticky note?" Henry nodded slowly. "Then we go in, stay quiet, and hope we're fast enough." Ethan pulled the car onto a quiet backstreet behind the Venetian room. They had one shot. This was it. They moved quickly. The back entrance was less guarded than the front, but that didn't mean it was easy. A single guard stood near the staff door, checking his phone. Henry turned to Ethan. "You got this." Ethan smirked. "Watch and learn." He walked forward casually, hands in his pockets. "Hey, man, you got a light?" The guard barely glanced up. "No." Ethan nodded. "Damn. You mind if I—" Crack. Before the guard could react, Ethan slammed his fist into the guy's throat. The man gasped, stumbling backward. Ethan caught him, lowering him to the ground silently. Emily blinked. That was aggressive. Ethan grinned. "You want it subtle?" Henry checked the hallway. "Let's move." They swiped the keycard. The staff door clicked open. They were in. The service elevator was old, dimly lit. The kind of thing you'd expect to find in a hotel's basement. Ethan pressed B3. The doors rattled shut. Emily exhaled. "I don't like this." Henry didn't either. The elevator creaked downward. Seconds felt like hours. Then, ding, the door slid open, and they stepped into Langley's underground lair. The hallway was cold, industrial, a stark contrast to the luxury upstairs. Concrete walls, dim lighting, the faint hum of security systems running. Henry whispered, "How far?" Ethan pointed down the hall. "The vault is at the end." They moved fast, quiet. Every footstep felt too loud. Then, Emily froze. "Wait." Henry turned. "What?" Emily crouched, running her fingers along the floor. "Look at this. Pressure plates. A single step in the wrong place would trigger the alarm." Henry clenched his jaw. Ethan sighed. "Figures." Emily pulled something from her pocket. A small vial of powder. Henry raised an eyebrow. She smirked. "What?" "I've seen movies." She carefully sprinkled a thin layer of powder in front of them. The particles settled over the hidden sensors, revealing a clear path. Henry nodded. Nice work. Emily grinned. Told you I was useful. They moved carefully, stepping around the traps. Finally, they reached the vault. It was massive, reinforced steel, the kind of thing that could survive a bomb blast. Ethan pulled out the 3D printed handprint. Henry exhaled. This better work. Ethan pressed it against the scanner. A beep. The screen flashed green. Emily grinned. Then, the passcode screen lit up. 10 digits. Henry's heart pounded. Ethan frowned. Now for the hard part. Emily stared. You don't have the code? Ethan gave her a look. If I had it, don't you think I would have said so? Henry thought fast. Langley's a control freak. He changes it regularly. We need to think. What numbers would he use? Emily bit her lip. His birthday? Ethan shook his head. Too obvious. Henry stared at the keypad. 10 digits. Then his mind clicked. He pressed. 19841211020. The screen flashed red. Denied. Ethan tensed. That's not good. A small red light flickered above the keypad. A silent alarm. They had seconds before guards flooded in. Henry thought fast. Langley was arrogant. He saw himself as untouchable. But he also had one weakness. Henry pressed. 20240511512. The screen flashed green. The vault unlocked. Ethan blinked. What was that? Henry smirked. Langley's daughter's birthday. Ethan chuckled. Genius. Emily grabbed Henry's sleeve. Hurry. Henry pushed the door open. Inside, rows of documents. Stacks of cash. Gold. Illegal transactions. Everything Langley wanted hidden. And in the center, the ledger. Henry grabbed it, flipping through the pages. Every name. Every deal. Every crime. Emily gasped. This is it. Henry nodded. Then, a voice behind them. Clapping. Slow. Mocking. They turned. Victor Langley. Standing in the doorway. Surrounded by armed men. Langley smiled. Well, that was impressive. Dawson stood beside him, smirking. Henry's stomach dropped. They had been waiting for them. Langley's smile widened. You really thought this was going to end well for you. Guns cocked. The trap had snapped shut, and Henry Clark was out of moves. Henry Clark stood frozen, gripping the ledger in his hands. Across the room, Victor Langley smiled. Behind him, Dawson stood with his usual smirk, and half a dozen armed guards aimed their weapons at Henry, Emily, and Ethan. The plan had worked. Too well. They had cracked the vault. They had everything they needed to take Langley down. But Langley knew they would come. Henry's mind raced. They were trapped inside a vault with no exits and guns pointed at their heads. Langley took a slow step forward, his polished shoes echoing in the silence. I'll admit, he mused, I underestimated you. His eyes flicked to Henry. You're a librarian, aren't you? What a ridiculous turn of events. Henry didn't respond. His fingers curled tighter around the ledger. Langley smirked. But let's not pretend you've won anything. I run this city, Henry. The police, the courts, the people who decide what's real and what isn't. He glanced at Dawson. How long before the news spins this? Dawson grinned. Couple of hours. Headline writes itself. 3 criminals caught attempting a multi-million-dollar heist. Langley chuckled. And by morning, your bodies will be found in the river. Henry felt Emily tense beside him. Ethan's jaw tightened. You really think you can cover this up? Langley tilted his head. You think anyone cares? Money buys truth, Ethan. And I have more than you can imagine. Henry exhaled slowly. They were outgunned, outnumbered, outplayed. But Henry had one thing Langley didn't. The truth. And Langley was so arrogant. Asterisk, so certain of his own victory. Asterisk, that he had just made his first mistake. Henry slowly lifted the ledger. You're right, he said, voice even. You own the courts, the police, the media. Langley's smirk deepened. But there's one thing you don't own, Henry continued. Langley raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Henry turned the ledger around. The tiny blinking light was now visible. A hidden transmitter. Langley's smile vanished. Henry took a step forward. You've been broadcasting this entire conversation. Langley's face darkened. Henry met his gaze. You just confessed to everything. Dawson's smirk faded. Langley's eye twitched. He turned to Dawson. Tell me that's not true. Henry finished for him. Go ahead. Turn on the news. Langley's hands clenched. Ethan grinned. Guess who doesn't own the entire media, Vic? Langley pulled his gun. Kill them. The guards moved. Then, sirens. The distant howl of police cars. A sudden explosion rocked the building. The guards hesitated. Ethan grinned. That's our ride. The vault door blew open. Smoke poured in, and from the haze, dozens of police officers flooded inside. Langley staggered back. No. Dawson turned, only to be tackled by 3 officers. Henry watched as Langley's empire crumbled. The officers swarmed in, disarming the guards. Emily let out a breath, gripping Henry's arm. Langley's face was twisted with rage. This isn't over, he hissed, struggling as officers cuffed him. Henry met his gaze. Yes, he said quietly. It is. 6 months later. The city was different now. The headlines had told the world everything. Corrupt business tycoon taken down in FBI sting. Hundreds of secret transactions exposed. Victor Langley facing life in prison. Henry Clark had become an overnight mystery. The quiet man who had stood alone in court. The nobody who had outsmarted one of the most powerful men in the country. And now, he was back where he had started. In his small library, he ran his fingers along the spines of old books, smiling. The world had changed. But Henry? He was still just Henry. The door opened. Emily stepped inside, a grin on her face. I figured I'd find you here. Henry smirked. Where else would I be? Ethan followed behind her, hands in his pockets. You know, people are still talking about you. Henry chuckled. Let them. Emily sat on the counter, crossing her legs. So what now? Henry thought for a moment. Then, with a small smile, he said, I think I'll read a book.